Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the Professor, Greg Dooley, and the pundit, Steve Clark. Men, take the mic.
It's the Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clark, and we are proudly presented by Nick Hopwood, who's a certified financial planner, founder, and president of Peak Wealth Management. Retire with confidence. We highly recommend going to Nick's website at peakwm.com. What a turbulent month in the market. A steep decline, thinking it might last through the election, and instead we have a rapid ascent back near to our record highs. Nick's going to help you navigate these choppy times with a solid plan, and when he does, you can relax and listen to podcasts like ours, Greg.
Ours indeed. So please follow, share, comment, ask us a question. It might make it on a future episode. You know where to find us, okay? Boy, Steve, I'm about to be found on campus at Michigan teaching my classes again. They're about a week away. 2 of my classes are waitlisted. I have about 10 seats in the history of college athletics. So I'm looking at almost certainly full classes again. Oh, and can I give a quick shout out to we mentioned last time I was doing that talk up in Petoskey to the U of M Club of Little Travis Bay. They were awesome. It was a packed house. Did about a 25, 30-minute mini lecture on deep history. And then we went into Q&A. Somebody asked me if I have ever met Connor Stallion, Steve. Do you know the answer to that question?
I think the answer is yes.
I did meet Connor Stallion.
I think we talked about it last year.
I don't know how many people have actually met Connor Stallion. I think we did. But thank you to those. And I think we picked up some new listeners, by the way. So if you are one of those people, thank you for attending. Thank you for sharing. The other thing I'm working on, Steve, is I'm starting to work on my This Week in Michigan Football Histories, which appear on the WTKA pregame show, which I'm not a major part of, but you are. Are you getting ready for that?
I am. Doing a lot of previews on the other teams. That's kind of my main specialty. It's kind of hard to beat Sam and Ira when it comes to inside Michigan knowledge, so I let them do their thing, and I just concentrate on the opponent that Michigan will play on each particular Saturday. So do that for every opponent going in. That means my season started in June. So I feel like I'm just about halfway as the actual season begins.
It's the perfect way, but it starts for people out of town. You can stream it, and the pregame show starts 4 hours before every game, right? And it goes up to an hour before when the network takes over. So if you are gearing up, you're out of town, you're doing some chores, and you want to get that feel for pregame, it's a perfect way to do it. And if you're in Ann Arbor, Joe's Garage right across from the stadium, the perfect place to watch it. So I'm excited to start doing this stuff. But we got to lead off with some football, man.
And in the second half, we're going to talk a lot about the New World Order, the new revenue sharing, the new revenue capping, how this affects Michigan and other teams across the country. But in the first half, one of the things that people are probably kind of getting used to the idea now is that nobody seems to be picking Michigan to win the Big Ten, despite winning it the last 3 years, and virtually nobody is picking the Wolverines to be in the playoff. And the question is, why not? And I think there's a few things that are at play, and we're just going to kind of quickly gloss over those things for the some that are just kind of tuning into the whole situation right now. But, J.J. McCarthy left, and that's a big deal. And if you've been any stranger to listening to Michigan broadcast, J.J. McCarthy was the real deal. Jim Harbaugh's best quarterback in his tenure since coming at Michigan. J.J. McCarthy selected 10th overall by the Minnesota Vikings. Between our last podcast and this one, we found out that J.J. is actually done for the year with a torn meniscus, which is a shame because he was really turning some heads in Minnesota Viking football camp. We're sorry to hear that. We wish the best for him and look forward to his 2025 football season, his new rookie year in the pros. But if he was that good as a Michigan quarterback, then there has to be some big shoes to fill in. And Alex Orji appears to be that guy as of right now.
We think so.
It's a 3-person race.
Yeah.
Nothing suggests to us right now that Alex Orji is in danger of losing that job. It just hasn't officially been announced yet. Alex Orji, we haven't seen him throw a pass since 2022, where he threw one pass. It was complete for 5 yards. Made multiple appearances in key situations for the Wolverines in 2023, but always kind of ran the ball out of the Wildcat.
And we saw him a little bit in spring, and for my eyes and some concerns. I thought some of the balls were behind people. They appeared to be. Can we correct that? Because we're going to need that accuracy moving forward. And Apparently, he did a lot of work after the spring, worked on it the summer.
Somewhere
So we
else,
think,
outside of Michigan, his own
Yes,
quarterback tutors and private workouts.
Correct. But I think, to your point, that's probably the number one reason. As we kind of hinted at last time, if JJ were back, they would probably be looking at Michigan in a different light. It would be how far in the playoff, or are they going to win it again? It's not the case. So I think that's number one. What's your number two reason you think people?
Offensive line.
Yeah.
And the biggest question there is when you lose every single starter on your offensive line, minus one who was a part-time starter. Miles Hinton started the first 5 or 6 games at left tackle before Ladarius Henderson took that over. The question here is simply, is Michigan's offensive line rebuilding with 5 new guys, or is it reloading with 5 new guys? And there's a difference between rebuilding when you don't know or feel like it's going to take time for that new group to catch up to the previous group, or you're just simply replacing 1A with 1B. Now, how close is 6 through 10 versus 1 through 5 now with another year of conditioning and another year of experience under their belt? That is the big question mark. And of course, if Michigan's offense is going to be catered around to the running game and to be able to pass protect, they've got to be fairly good. Now, they made one addition to their offensive line as they got a third-team All-Big Ten Conference member in Northwestern's Josh Prevey. He is going to be starting at the right guard. And there's a couple of position battles going on at center with 2 very capable guys that Michigan scribes don't feel like is a major concern, and then at the right tackle spot, which there's a little bit more of a concern. Nothing's been named yet, and in Michigan style, they probably won't tell you until you see them line up at the 25-yard line at the kickoff.
Yeah, I'm not expecting any leaks on quarterback or offensive line or really any starting positions other than the obvious ones. Are we going to really know who's going to be out there?
And then the last thing is simply schedule.
Well, that's where I think a lot of fans are, right? I think a lot of fans are expecting us to lose probably multiple games solely because of that, the daunting schedule with the new teams in and the gauntlet we have to go through.
Michigan is going to be starting right out of the gate in non-conference in the second week of the year, playing Texas at home. Greg, I don't know if you want to go over this, but I kind of listed the top 5 teams that going to give Michigan the most trouble with.
So this is the top 5 toughest opponents. You've already mentioned Texas, but let's rank. You have them ranked in your mind. Let me see if I agree with you. Go ahead.
So number 5, the road game at Washington. It is the second toughest road game I think Michigan is going to be having in the year, having to go out into former Pac-12 territory. There's been a lot of good Michigan teams in the past that have gone out west only to lose. In fact, in the early part of this century, twice Michigan was the 3rd-ranked team in the nation, had to go play an unranked team or a modestly ranked team out west, and they lost both of those games in surprising fashion. But the game out in Washington, if you think Michigan's got turnover, Washington has even more turnover. They have 2 starters returning, both of them on defense. Everybody is going to be new on offense. Makes it really hard for the Washington staff to show imagery of current Washington players from 2024 to put in their media guide or to give out for photo publicity because they're all new.
Yeah, of course, new coaching staff with DeBoer going to Alabama. They've probably got a bigger change there than we're, which is more of a transition.
Obviously, the offensive line is completely new. How about those receivers? 3 of them going into the NFL, and they had 5 guys, Greg, that combined for just under 4,200 passing yards and 35 touchdowns that are gone. And they lose their top 3 tight ends from 2023. The one thing that they do is they have a pretty decent quarterback coming in, a guy named Will Rogers, and who has thrown for 71 touchdown passes in 2021 and 2022 under Mike Leach's air raid system at Mississippi State. Try to make a long story short, new coach in 2023 to succeed Mike Leach. Didn't do the air raid. It threw Will Rogers out. The coach got fired before the season ended. And then Will Rogers wasn't going to stick around for the next guy. So he's over at Washington, and he may be their saving grace offensively. In the trenches, Washington has a lot of work to do. So that is my number 5 team.
Right. Nonetheless, though, a team that made it, obviously, to the national championship game. So this is a rematch, and on paper, this is a network's dream to have this. We'll see what shape the teams are in when we arrive at this game, which is what week, Steve?
That is October 5th.
I've already heard from people who are making the trip. I am not planning on making the trip out there. But I hear the people that are going there and they're doing the whole thing, and they have a name for it, where the boats arrive and you go to the stadium.
Sailgating.
Sailgating. There you go. Very clever. I think I tend to agree with you just because of how much Washington lost, which brings up number 4, Steve. Who's your number 4? Toughest challenge Michigan's going to have this year?
USC. Why? Well, they're one of the teams that are ranked. Michigan is playing 4 ranked teams. These are preseason ranked teams, but they're one of the 4. They're inside the top 25, nearly out of it. Lincoln Riley is under fire because his defense was so bad, but they've made an adjustment there in their coaching staff. Alex Grinch does not have a great reputation wherever he goes defensively. He finally got booted from USC, and they went and got a guy who is part of the Ravens football staff in 21 and 2022. This guy, Danton Lynn, would have been possibly another guy that Michigan could go to as a defensive coordinator. He ended up being a defensive coordinator at UCLA in 2023 and took them from like 83rd to 13th in one season in total defense and scoring. So he got hired immediately over to USC, and then USC is going to have one of the better quarterbacks in the Big Ten, at least what we think. Miller Moss replaces Caleb Williams, the Heisman Trophy winner from 2022 and the number 1 pick overall by the Chicago Bears. In his debut in the Holiday Bowl, he threw for 6 touchdowns and 372 yards against Louisville. That right there, in a bad Big Ten quarterback conference, elevates you up to like maybe one of the 4 best quarterbacks in the Big Ten. That does so right off the bat. So they have a lot of talent. They just never seem to put it together. And again, it's about the trenches in the Big Ten, and USC is kind of lacking there compared to what we remember when we were kids, Greg, in the 70s and the 80s, where they had all Americans in the trenches. USC in the Pac-12 of recent years don't have that in the trenches as much.
Yeah, well, they're going to need that if they're going to tangle in the Big Ten. And so I think that's atop of everyone's mind. How do these new teams fare in the Big Ten? We know the history of Penn State, Nebraska, teams that had amazing success before they joined the Big Ten. Will they succeed? That's a question for USC. I think I agree with your first 2, Steve. The next one's got to be either Oregon or Texas, I'm guessing.
And it is. It's Texas who is coming in at week 2. And it's kind of hard to start differentiating between the top 3, but I'll try to do so fairly quickly. When Texas comes into Michigan Stadium in week 2, they're going to have one of the most talented offenses in the country. Quarterback, receivers, offensive line, running backs got dinged up. They had a 2-headed monster at Texas, but C.J. Baxter, their main guy, has a season-ending injury in fall camp. He won't be around, and they lost another guy in their running back room. But they still have Jaden Blue. He and C.J. Baxter combined for over 1,000 yards rushing as the 2 backup guys last year, number 2 and number 3 running backs. So they are stacked everywhere. And Texas is going to have one of those lines that's going to be considered for the Joe Moore Award. So they are solid in the trenches. The reason why I have Texas at number 3 is their defense doesn't appear to be as good as their offense. I would say they're more built for a national championship team offensively, but not at the same caliber level as the other 2 teams I'm going to talk about defensively. And that's why they're at number 3.
Excellent. So number 2 must be Oregon.
It is going to be the Oregon Ducks. But right now, I'm kind of thinking that Oregon might win the Big Ten, because they are absolutely stacked offensively and defensively. I like their head coach. I like the way they're going. The problem with Oregon is they haven't won yet. They seem to have had a lot of talented teams that seem to be ready on both sides of the ball, and something happens. They've lost to Washington 3 straight games. They've lost a pair of games in the same season to Utah. Oregon can lose to Stanford on a regular basis. There's something there that Oregon can't get over the hump. In fact, they're kind of Penn State-like of recent years, where it seems like they are ready to go, but when it comes to their biggest games, they kind of fall just short. Not because they fall flat, they just fall short and haven't gotten over the hump. But if we think Ohio State is as soft and Ryan Day can't coach and they can't put things together in big moments, then that has to leave room for an Oregon team to be able to step up there and perhaps win the Big Ten themselves.
Arguably the most hyped team near the tail end of last season before they, surprisingly, huge favorite, lost to Washington, if I recall correctly, Steve. Going up to the end of the season, they were on a roll, and everyone had them firmly, squarely in the playoff. And among the teams to beat, and that fell off.
Right. Oregon and Washington played like in week 6. So that's either late September or early October, okay? And Oregon just barely lost at Washington. And then you're right. The momentum going in from the games after that, Washington was struggling. They were letting some fourth quarter games get away from them. Of course, Washington still won, but Oregon looked like a juggernaut. And everybody thought that Oregon would beat Washington in the rematch, and they didn't.
Yep.
And then Washington moved on.
They were almost 2 touchdown favorites or something.
Yeah, and they beat Texas. And now I'm going to tell you, I just finished my preview for Oregon on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA, and you can certainly archive the entire preview there. They have to replace a ton of people, but they didn't rebuild. They reloaded.
Okay.
So Bo Nix was a finalist for the Heisman Trophy. They're replacing him with Oklahoma transfer Dylan Gabriel, who may be the favorite to win the Heisman Trophy. They lose a 1,000-yard back. They're going to replace him with 2 guys who each could go for 1,000 yards. And if you think that's enough, they're losing a 1,000-yard receiver. They expect to have 2 1,000-yard receivers coming back. And then the offensive line, are they losing their Remington Award-winning center? Yes, but they've got 2 tackles that might be honorable mention All-Americans and first-team Big Ten players at the tackle spot. Oregon is reloading.
Yeah.
And their defense, knowing that they've gone into the Big Ten, is the best prepared to handle the physicality of the Big Ten. And they did that by getting transfers to plug up the middle, where they traditionally didn't care in the Pac-12. They're plugging that up with one guy who led the Big 12 in sacks last year, and another guy, one of Michigan State's best defensive linemen, Derek Harmon is coming in, and he's going to start there. So Oregon is prepared. Is it enough to beat Ohio State and the super team that's a $20 million roster? That's what we'll have to wait and see.
Well, and again, the Big Ten gauntlet, right? I do wonder how much that factors in on some of these West Coast teams. We'll see. Michigan fans probably remember 2007, one of the more interesting years in Michigan football history. Lloyd Carr's last year, of course, starting with the Appalachian State game. I don't need to remind you. But what happened next was the last time we played Oregon, which was that 39-7, absolutely the most horrible beatdown I've ever seen of a Michigan team. Could have been worse. That's the last time we've played Oregon. That's the last time, of course, they were at Michigan Stadium. We're hoping to reverse that. We have not beat an Oregon team. We've played them 5 times. We haven't beat them since the 70s, since one of Bo's first seasons. So we'll see how that goes. So that must leave, Steve, your number 1 team, of course. We're talking about the Buckeyes.
Yeah.
In Columbus, of course.
Right. The game is in Columbus. And, of course, everybody thought that Michigan would lose in Columbus in 2022. I think Michigan is in Ohio State's head. I think Ohio State has everything to lose and not much to gain. Now, how can you say that when they're expected to win the national championship? It's almost becoming a necessity, the way that the hype is built up around this team, and for a lot of good reasons. You look at the top 100 players that are ranked in ESPN in college football. I think Ohio State has 8 of the top 100 players. Obviously, Ohio State has a ton of talent on defense. They are arguably the best defense in America. Pro Football Focus has them rated as the number 1 defensive line, number 1 in the secondary in the nation, 10th at linebackers. I think quarterback's still a very, very big question for Ohio State. And I may be the only one saying this, which could make me the oddball. But I think Ohio State getting Will Howard to replace Kyle McCord is not an upgrade. And that this may be the worst quarterback spot position that Ohio State's been in since 2008 when Todd Beckman started and was eventually replaced by Terrell Pryor mid to late September. The offensive line is another big question mark for them.
This is a tough team right here.
The running back situation is probably the best in football, where you've got the number 2 and the number 3 active leaders in the positions, both playing on the same team, and Travion Henderson and Ole Miss transfer Quidshon Junkins.
Last year, we talked about, Steve, you said that this one counts 3, or this one counts for Michigan. Michigan had more to lose. More was on the line. This time, you're right, for Ohio. In fact, I think most people will conclude if Ryan Day loses this game, he's gone.
I'm emotional about this for a reason.
So this is a big deal for Ohio State. They have plenty to gain, but this will be a big deal for them. But, Steve, you talked about schedule being one of the factors why Michigan, people are kind of like slotting Michigan. How high level, how does the schedule shake out for some of these contenders We've talked about last week, Penn State really doesn't play the schedule that everyone else does. But how about some of these contenders? How do they fare? Are they all playing each other? Does someone have a schedule that stacks up like Michigan?
So as we mentioned last week, Penn State's schedule is at USC, at Wisconsin, home to Ohio State in back-to-back-to-back weeks. One loss will get you in the playoff. It might even get you in the championship game of the Big Ten. So Penn State, because of that schedule, I believe, and plus because of the talent on both sides of the ball, they're expected to be in the playoff more so than Michigan. And they're kind of close in the rankings. And, the Michigan hasn't played a game yet, so there's some of that national championship reality that sets in. We're going to rank you high until you get beaten. But I think most people, when it comes to predicting of being in the championship game or being in the playoff, most people have Penn State slightly ahead of Michigan. You have to look at Iowa. If they have a pulse on offense with their new offensive coordinator who came out of Western Michigan from a few years ago, that can make a difference. Iowa plays only one ranked team at Ohio State. They'll lose that game. But can you get into the Big Ten championship game with one loss? Yeah, I think it's very possible. They have Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Washington. They're all at home. Maryland is their only other game that is close to being a 50-50 game. They play that out on the road. Their West Coast trip for the Hawkeyes is UCLA, considered the weakest of the four former Pac-12 teams. No Michigan, no Penn State, Oregon, or USC on the Hawkeyes schedule. So Iowa and Penn State really have to take advantage of the schedule to get themselves in line to make it in the Big Ten championship game. And then as for Michigan's concerned, who else is playing the number 1, 2, 3, 4 teams in the country? The only team that Michigan isn't playing is Georgia. And it's those 4 teams, they're the top tier. Those 4 teams, Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, and Texas, are the top tier. And then there's a drop-off after that. And Michigan's playing 3 of those 4 games. 2 of them are at home. The regular season is the playoff for Michigan. They're going to get some opportunities. I think if they win one of those 3 games, then I think Michigan's got a good chance of making the playoff, provided that they don't lose to, say, at Washington or lose a rivalry game with Michigan State or something like that.
Yeah, okay. Very good, man. Any other football notes you want to share, Steve, before we head to halftime?
No, I think we can do that next week. And we have lots to talk about, especially the New World Order that's going to start for the 25 football season. It's not only going to affect Michigan football, it's going to affect all the sports at Michigan and all the other sports going on in the Big Ten and nationally. Greg has done some tremendous research on it. He's part of his teaching studies is on this court situation that had a settlement just a couple of months back, and we'll kind of go through it here in the second half on The Professor and the Pundit. That whistle means it's halftime here on The Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clark. And joining us in studio right now is Nick Hopwood, the certified financial planner, founder, and president of Peak Wealth Management. Nick, great to see you again.
Great to be here, Steve. Thank you.
Real estate around Michigan Stadium. I have learned that some people have multiple dwellings around Michigan Stadium that they would either rent out or just as a getaway for something convenient when they're in town in Ann Arbor this weekend. Real estate still important in today's world of investing?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what you're referring to could be, a regular rental where you have someone paying the bills 12 months of the year and then you're tailgating in the driveway or the yard. Or it could be an Airbnb setup around the stadium. There's a lot of opportunity for that. Personally, I have a lot of duplexes, which is your annual rentals. And I think it's great because it's a pension for me.
How so?
It's a pension for me because the tenants between now and retirement are paying off the mortgages. And then once the mortgages are paid off, I get into retirement. And now all of that income is free and clear as a pension for me without doing any work.
Wow. So the individual acquires the real estate. The tenants pay for the mortgage. And then when the mortgage is complete, you get 100% of the rent. Well, if you want to know more about real estate investing, go to peakwm.com or call 734-681-7575. That's peakwm.com. And welcome back to The Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clark. And we wanted to save the second half of this show to talk about something very, very complicated, but we know our listenership is greatly interested in this type of talk. Just a couple of months ago, Greg.
They're very sophisticated, Steve. Their houses smell of old leather and cognac like Ron Burgundy's house are sophisticated. What does he say?
I have many leather-bound books and My apartment smells of rich mahogany.
Yeah, we're very sophisticated.
How's that?
Yeah.
About a couple of months ago, there was a proposed settlement that was eventually agreed upon by all of the major conferences. It affects all of the FBS and it affects all of the FCS as well. And it's about back payment to players going back to 2016 and how we revenue share with players in the future. Greg, I want to turn it over to you. Just kind of start with the basics. I'm going to fill in with a few questions and a few additives because it's something I've been trying to pay attention to, but probably not at the same level as you have.
Yeah, and again, the settlement is fairly recent. And what it was, there was a series of lawsuits. Most people just put it on this headline of house. So you hear the term the house settlement. It refers to a bunch of groups that were suing. They came to an agreement, and that agreement, like Steve said, involved the major conferences, representatives of the players, obviously the people suing, where they said, okay, here's a plan. We agree to it. And just to clarify, Steve, the judge hasn't said, yes, I agree, I accept your settlement, because they allow a window for people to object. Is there anything that might shake the judge off saying, yes, I accept your settlement? Was there anything wrong done? So there is a period for that. But I do expect the judge to agree on the settlement soon. So there, as you pointed out, there are two big parts that you should know. And we'll talk about football first in a second. But there is a paying players since 2016, which mainly applies to Division I players who played sports since 2016, and a chunk of money, I'll use big round numbers, about $3 billion. By the way, Steve, about $1 billion of that goes to the lawyers. Can you believe this?
Yes.
It's almost a third.
We don't see a dollar until you see a dollar, but we'll take 50 cents of it.
You got to remember, when they keep throwing these numbers around, you got to remember how much the lawyers are getting. A big pile of money is going to be paid over 10 years to actual athletes who played since 2016. So, 2016 roster. That was the JT was short year for Michigan. We had guys like Rashawn Gary on the roster, and some of these guys, Josh Uche was on, like, they're in the NFL. They're actually going to get a cut of this, and there's a formula to determine how much they actually get of this settlement, and it's not uniform. They've put averages out there. Okay, you want to talk about it?
I do. First of all, I think people ask me, why 2016? Why doesn't this go all the way back to the 1970s? Well, 2016
I would
is
say,
the
why not the
period
60s then?
Yeah.
Okay, but go ahead.
where players got prevented and punished for trying to make money off their name, image, and likeness, which is a part of the name of your class.
Right.
NIL.
So those of you pining for Denard to get finally what he deserved from every single person in Ann Arbor wearing a Denard jersey, it's not happening for Denard.
No.
Go ahead.
40% of this $3 billion settlement that will take place over 10 years, so that's $300 million a year, 40% is going to be paid by the NCAA. 60% will be paid by the institutions. I'm going to break it down even further. 24% will come from the Power Four. The group of five will pay 10%. And in the most controversial move, the non-football schools in Division I are going to pay 12%. So most of the money is coming from football, but Division I schools who are known for basketball are going to pay about 12% of that freight, which makes them cry foul. You want to talk about objections that could still be filed?
Yeah.
That could be a part of it.
Right. And so a lot of that money now the NCAA has a revenue stream, and that revenue stream solely pretty much is the NCAA tournament. And that goes to
basketball.
That's basketball. So that goes to the conferences. The conferences, at least the Big Ten, shares that with everyone. As one AD put it, they're having their wages garnished. So they're going to use some of those future revenue streams to fund this, right? Amongst the other things you described. Now, you're talking about who's paying and how it's being paid. What I was kind of getting at is how much, say, a Rashawn Gary gets versus, say, a backup varsity volleyball player. Okay, there is some formulas involved in there too, as far as how it's supposed to be paid out looking back. And there, by the way, I've heard there are some objections from people, from groups like that, saying we're paying too much of this back pay. We shouldn't be.
And that's part one. Part two is how things will change allegedly beginning next year in the 25-26 calendar year?
Yeah, so obviously the past payments have an impact because that's reducing revenues that traditionally the athletic department thought they could spend. So it matters. But the big thing looking forward is come up with a system of fair compensation and allow it fit a structure for teams that is sustainable moving forward. Okay, so in other words, we're not just putting a dollar sign out there and saying good luck figuring it out. They actually tried to do more. So this is a proposal, another 10 years out, of proposing big money, over $20 million per school, to share some of their revenue. And again, there's some outlines of formulas of how and why they came up with that number, but they came up basically with, here's the revenue that the average Power 5 school earns. Of that, they came up with a number of 20. It's going to get bigger as the TV contracts grow, and so that can be given back to athletes. How they give it back and how much goes to each team and player gets really interesting. We actually don't know yet, but one thing they did, Steve, that I think will catch a lot of people's attention if you haven't heard this already, they have gotten rid of this whole notion of walk-ons. They've gotten rid of the whole notion of partial scholarships. So take the wrestling team. Traditionally, the wrestling team had 9.9 scholarships to give out on a team that was much bigger. So that team was filled up with either walk-ons or people who had a partial scholarship. The football team didn't work that way. They had 85. They said, no, we're not doing this partial anymore, but we're going to tell you how many people you can have on your roster, and you can give every single one of them a scholarship. Okay.
You can. You don't have to.
Well, absolutely. Okay, so here we go. Hopefully we haven't lost anybody. So football in this settlement can have 105 roster spots, all fully scholarshiped, and everyone's expecting that will happen. Of course, Steve, the football team had many, many more than 105 and has many, many more than 105 football players on the team because it has walk-ons, and now in the NIL era has people supplemented with NIL. They can come to Michigan, they can play football, and through other means, collective NIL opportunities, fund their time here and their tuition. This is part of this, okay, we're going to fix this, so you just can't have 1 million people on your roster who are all paid with NIL. We're going to say it's 105, and that's what they're doing. But they did the same thing with all the other sports. So I mentioned, let's talk about softball. Softball has 12 scholarships available right now. They're saying you can have a roster of 25, and you can give scholarships to 25 people.
Scholarships.
Full scholarships, okay. So roughly speaking, Michigan has about 1,000 varsity athletes. About a third get a scholarship. That's the maximum right now that the NCAA, that includes those 85 on the football team, the 9.9, on the wrestling team. About a third get a scholarship. All told, the financial aid to students is about $35 million. It's almost $100,000 per scholarship athlete right now. The question is Michigan going to say, okay, we'll give each of our 1,000 athletes a scholarship now that we can? That means like there's 60, 70 some odd rowers. Will they all get a scholarship now? This would cost Michigan anywhere between like 50 to 60 million additional dollars. It's not going to happen, Steve.
No.
Okay. Now we're talking about Michigan, who has all kinds of crazy revenue from all these home football games. By the way, donations aren't part of this. You can't count donations, but Michigan has all this revenue, and the Big Ten has this giant TV contract. Why do you think UCLA, these teams wanted to come here? It's not going to fund 1,000 scholarships in Michigan, who once again has more varsity sports than most schools have, especially in the SEC. What are we going to do about it? So are schools going to be left to their own devices to say, hey, I want to fund our soccer team or our swim program? I'm thinking about Indiana, who has very good swim team and very good soccer team. Are we going to load up on the soccer team and say, maybe our football team stays at 85, or something like that. So we have some big decisions to make here about how the money's allocated.
Every school is going to have to prioritize each of their sports and figure it out.
Or the conference is going to have to come together, Steve, knowing that some schools have different sports. Not everyone has a hockey program. How you divide this up or create some limits on this to keep competitiveness fair. Or, Steve, to your point, if they just say, School, you figure it out, then it's going to be wild for a bit.
It is, because everything comes back to football. And it's true. If you are not paying the most amount in football compared to your peers, then you're losing out. You're losing out on the availability to recruit players, to bring them in. So a lot of money wants to be spent on football. That's going to come at a cost. What universities will probably figure out on their own, and there's multiple layers to this. If you say you have a great tennis team, or you want a women's ice hockey team, which is what they want to do at the University of Michigan, that may come at an expense of another sport by not funding anybody, or in some cases, at some universities, may try to drop the program, which has not been an easy thing to do, because colleges and universities try to drop programs and they find themselves in court for dropping the program. And in some cases, they have to reinstate it because they lose in court. Another layer of this is Title IX. If you have 85 scholarships and you're going to increase it to the full roster of 105, then you're creating at least 20 new women's scholarships, because that's part of what Title IX says you have to do. So there will be some increases into women's sports, but they can be methodically placed wherever. And then what some institutions outside the Big Ten are trying to figure out, and maybe even within the Big Ten itself, is trying to figure out, when we do the revenue sharing, it's not just scholarships, but giving any extras. Can I front load almost all of it to one sport, or do I have to make sure that if I'm giving the football team an extra $10 million, the other half has to diversified into women's sports? That is still up for debate.
I think so. I don't think most people are arguing with any teeth that the football players aren't going to get a large, significant chunk of that money. In fact, models have been thrown out there for how this might work, and nowhere does it say that a women's rowing team is getting anywhere close to a football team. But the whole question of Title IX really isn't covered in the settlement, because that's really on the schools to interpret the federal law and apply it to their situation. So there are people saying this and that, but it actually becomes a problem. If you actually just peanut butter spread equally all of this money, you would get lawsuits on the other side, Steve, from the football players going, I'm worth more than this. And this is
correct.
This is a trust violation in and of itself, that you are denying me what is right.
I believe it's going to court no matter what.
Yeah.
Just like you talked about, if everything is spread out evenly, there will be people representing football players and basketball players that will go to court saying we deserve more because we're actually bringing more in. If it is weighted 80-20, men to women, then you're going to get a lawsuit for women's sports advocates saying that it needs to be 50-50, and they'll use Title IX as their defense. I'm not advocating a side who would win. I'm not informed enough to say who would win. I just believe that whatever happens is going to end up being in the courts in the future.
It is, yes. It most likely will. Now, there are things that can be done to avoid some of that. Number one is a federal antitrust law that protects this settlement in these matters. It could be done, and actually I think it's more likely to be done now than ever, that there is a settlement on the table. It's an easier step to go, give us some protection against some future lawsuits and let us try this and see how it works. That could happen. The other thing is where the money is distributed. If you actually distribute the money through a vehicle like the Big Ten Conference, the Big Ten Conference itself isn't going to get the same scrutiny as it's not. The Big Ten doesn't receive federal funding for educational purposes. The Big Ten itself it could be distributed, or the Big Ten could hire a third party to distribute the money and direct it directly from the TV money and avoid all this. So there are things. I think reasonable heads realize there has to be a sharp imbalance, because that's the reality of where the money is coming from, namely football, basketball. And by the way, most people who propose a share have a big, sizable chunk for women's basketball players. They know this is an up-and-coming sport, so we'll see.
The third element to me in all of this that hasn't been discussed is what happens to NIL collectives.
Yeah.
And they are not going away. And in fact, if you've ever followed salary caps in professional sports, the salary cap is never a hard cap. There's always been the Larry Bird exception. There is the luxury tax. None of these things are officially in this new bargaining that's going on, but the NIL collectives would still continue to be able to raise money and be able to give dollars over top of this revenue sharing cap of $20 to $22 million for 25-26. But the nuance in this is that there is going to be some sort of clearinghouse where the payments need to be authorized and sent through to make sure that it's acceptable.
Exactly. They're trying to get rid of this direct payment from fan gives, booster gives collective money, collective gives player money. They're trying to get for doing really nothing. They're trying to get rid of that. They're trying to get to a world where NIL deals are authentic marketing or promotional deals with money behind it from an actual advertiser or sponsor, and get away from this collective nonsense. To do that, they're proposing that deals over certain size will be reviewed and legislated. Okay, I don't know if they can do that. I don't know how they're going to regulate that. They're proposing something, but will that happen? I don't know, Steve.
It's not being done by the NCAA.
Okay.
That we know.
No, but to your point, NIL isn't going away, and I don't think collectives are going away. In fact, collectives might be maybe propped up or transformed into the parties that actually will distribute this money. Does the athletic department really want to get in the business of distributing this money back to Title IX and other things? It's probably not something they're very good at. They're good at taking your money, Steve. I don't know how good they are at giving it out, okay?
But that's why it seems like every school is now hiring a general manager.
Yeah. So in the NFL, Steve, you know that the split between the players and the owners is approximately 50-50. So of revenue, that the owners and the players are in it together. The way they've bargained is it's about a 50-50 split. So the people who crafted this settlement, now athletic departments are different, but what they tried to come up with was about that the athletic department's taking in this. And once you tally up all the benefits to athletes, that's a scholarship, that's training table, that's facilities, that's Alston money, which is about $6,000 a year that any athlete, scholarship or not, can get now. And then you add this additional $20 million. That is about half of what the average athletic department revenue is. Not Michigan, but about the half. So that's how they tried to justify it as a fair settlement. So, but we are moving, like it or not, we are moving more toward a model where rosters are going to be managed. While we're not going to technically have caps, with all this money flowing around, it's got to be distributed somehow, and you need someone like a general manager to do it. And yes, Michigan has a general manager for the athletic department now, a woman named Tracy Whitehead, and Michigan, as many of you know, brought back an assistant coach, Sean McGee, who came from the NFL. He did what he's doing now for the Bears, and he's actually managing the NIL for the football team in those relationships. So I am skeptical that anything will be done to regulate the non-authentic NIL deals as we move forward. If there's one thing I am most curious about, it is the downstream, the other sports. I'm fascinated to talk to Bonnie Thole next time I talk to her and go, are you recruiting for 25? Are you asking Ward Manuel for 25 scholarships? What has anyone said about, are you going to get more scholarships? How many more? How are you going to work this out? What discussions have been made? Bev Plotky on the gymnastics team, Sean Bourmet on the wrestling team. Okay, what about the sports that have scholarships endowed by a donor in the past? Are we holding those and adding new ones because they have ones endowed? I mean, there are a ton of questions for the other sports, Steve.
Yes, I know. And we're going to talk about it on future episodes throughout the season on The Professor and the Pundit. And in a nutshell, most people know that football is the bread and butter of everybody's revenue for every university. And the biggest concern is about a school that is good enough to basically put all their chips in one basket, that being football, and being able to get away with it, and how that affects you're able to recruit and retain players on your future rosters. And everybody wants to make sure that nobody is out too far ahead of them, because one recruiting cycle and 1 year of success can permanently put you at the top or permanently put you down at the bottom. And some of those schools that are already at the bottom are probably starting to wonder, maybe we need to allocate most of our resources towards basketball and be successful in that area as opposed to football.
And I know we're wrapping up, Steve, but if I were at least the Big Ten, which up until last fall got along generally good with Michigan did, I would get the schools together and probably suggest either 2 or 3 tiers of sports and say, look, this tier, which some of them used to have varsity programs, we're going to have a special designation for them, but they're not going to have scholarships in our league or something like that, or we're going to limit the scholarships in our league. These sports over here, they're going to have the full rosters. You can have them if you want, and or get with another big program, another big conference rather, and kind of have that same conversation around competitiveness if we want to have a sane future. Because if we just throw, again, you're going to see Indiana's swim program and its soccer program, they're going to push all their chips in. And I'm not saying they're going to do that despite the football program, but somebody else is getting cut. And people at Michigan are going to scream. They're going to like, this isn't fair, Ward. I need my 20. I thought we were leaders in best. Indiana's fully funded on their swim team.
What you could find is in some non-revenue sports, there might be 2 or 3 schools that put most of their chips in that basket, and they will dominate everybody because they're the ones that are offering the scholarships.
Yeah.
And all the rest of the Big Ten institutions won't be offering scholarships.
Yeah.
Top athletes in that particular sport are going to go there, and it will be those same teams every year in, year out, and you won't be able to get a coach that will want to coach there as well.
Yeah, and again, while this settlement is likely, it should be approved soon, and it go into effect next year, coaches all right now probably have to get some guidance on how we're going to fall here with this, with the rosters, with the scholarships, because they're having conversations, Steve, right now with potential student athletes who are going to be affected by this.
And then everything and all this work that's been put into this, Greg, may be turned over on its ear if one judge somewhere in the country says these players are employees. And that will change everything all over again.
Yep.
If that happens, we will certainly be there to talk about it. But the one thing that I am very happy to tell you as we wrap up, Michigan football are the reigning national champions. Go Blue, Greg.
Go Blue.